we're back for another episode of Unit E podcast, and it's George, Margaret, and Flora. And today we have another special guest for this episode. And Arthur, can you give the audience an introduction of yourself?
All right. Hi, guys. My name's Arthur. I go to the Canadian International School of Beijing. I've lived in Beijing for 12 years, but I mean, all of a sudden, I feel like last year I've suddenly I've garnered a strong passion for the city. So, well, that's basically what I'm here to talk about. Just here to talk about Beijing and how Beijing has urbanized.
Yeah, nice. So so first we'll be talking about like what do we know about cities? So like I guess what makes a great city? So what's your definition of a great city, Arthur?
Well, I mean that is actually a very broad question. It actually is quite difficult to answer because people look for different things. I mean, I think there's definitely the contrast between two terms. To answer your question, there's to answer this question, I'm going to have to get into a bit of semantics, if you will. So there are two terms I really want to share, which is urbanization and urbanism. Now, although the two terms sound very similar, they actually hold very different meanings. So, for the term urbanization, it's about the process of making an area make an area more urban. So basically, turning, let's say, a old grass field into an area for apartment complexes, or taking a old village and turning it into a industrial area. So like that's what urbanization looks like, or even like redeveloping a smaller area within the urban environment. That can also count as urbanization, as we've seen all over China with a lot of gentrification projects, turning older buildings into new and supposedly exciting things. Now, the other term I want to discuss is urbanism, which is um, which is about how people live in cities. More specifically, urbanism is the characteristic of life within a city, basically. How people live, how people survive, how people interact with others within an urban environment. And to me, it's the latter is the more important thing, and the more interesting thing when it comes to understanding what a great city is. So when I think of a great city, uh, I usually think of a city where people can meet together. People aren't separated from each other, whether that be very large, very wide roads, or very uninteresting projects where apartments are separated very far are separated apart, but more close quarters residential areas. For example, like the hutangs, which as you can probably tell when visiting, there's not a lot of space there, and there's an intrinsic charm to that, I feel, as people kind of rely on each other in a sense because of the space that they share with them. And I think that's what makes a great city. So that's what I think a great city is. I was wondering what you guys think. What makes a great city for you guys?
So first of all, I have like a question. So you're talking about how you think like building connections with people is what makes a city great. But like I think currently as like Beijing is like progressing more and more, I feel like this connection is like getting lost during the process. So do you think that's like a positive or negative? Because I do think that like as we're like progressing, it's like there are like good things about it, but also like yeah. What do you think about it?
I mean, yeah, this is why I also feel like Beijing's such an exciting city to like live in. It's just
Mm-hmm.
like how fast, how rapidly the city is just developing. I mean, for example, the region where, well, the neighborhood where BCIS is located in, between, I should say, Shuangjing and Baiziwar.
Yeah.
A few decades ago, barely nothing was there. I mean, Baiziwar literally used to be like the field,
Mm-hmm.
like a farmland right outside of Guangqumen, which basically was the whole was basically just what the area was just for. It was just for a farmland. But nowadays, it's become a huge residential quarter, and especially in Shuangjing, especially in an area where a lot of expats live. So you can just see how quickly an area can be developed. And honestly, even though like Shuangjing and Baizuwar have been, constructed and built up like relatively recently, it feels like it's the center of the city. It really does. And to an extent, I feel like that's pretty good because in a weird way, the initial idea of constructing housing within the inner city and within the inner city per se in Beijing was to make everything as close as possible. And although that does make everything feel very cramped a lot of times, and also a lot of places feel very overcrowded, I think in the long term, I think it's good for establishing community, and I think it's great for establishing a sense of identity within the neighborhood. Now, as you also touched on how Beijing's rapidly expanding, I do have some opinions on that. um, too long-winded to really discuss in this podcast episode at least. But I feel like a lot of the expansion has somewhat resembled the suburbanization of a lot of American cities, as we've seen, in America and even in Europe. However, with the added caveat of instead of small single-family houses, you just see large apartments. And to an extent, I think that's a good thing because people do want to live outside the city because it's too cramped. They feel like it's too difficult to live in. So maybe a bit of more breathing space would be feel better. However, it is my opinion that when urban developers or when urban planners try to make a city or like a part of a city look quote unquote beautiful, at least from a bird's eye view, it might not necessarily be the best for people to live in. As it might just be better, well, it might just be more comfortable for people just to stay indoors rather than to hit the streets. Hit the streets rather. And I don't think that's great for the long-term identity of a city. And I do think Beijing should be careful about that. However, with that being said, I think Beijing is a city with a very strong character. So I feel like it's not that character is not necessarily in threat yet. But yeah, that's what I think. That's what I think of on that point.
Okay.
So maybe now we can talk about like what we like about the city and like what we know about
Yeah.
it, I guess. Yeah.
Hmm.
So as for me, like I moved here around like 7 years ago, and what I like about it is that comparing to the cities that I lived like prior to like here, I think it's more like there are more like skyscrapers, and it feels more urban. But one thing that I don't like is of course like the pollution and like just the amount of like noise and stuff. But I think that's also one characteristic of the city that makes it like kind of the center of like all of like the companies and some of like the um investment banks and finance centers and stuff. But as for like what I really know about it, I don't think I have a lot of knowledge on that, because I have very little research done on that realm. But I think as for now, I do think that the city is a very suitable place for like more citizens to live in. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that sort of goes into like what makes a great city. I mean, for a lot of people, their criteria for that literally is just is it comfortable to live in? So yeah, adding to that point, I mean, like, what do you guys like feel like? Um, what do you guys think of Beijing? Like, is it what you would call a great city or like a great city to live
Better than New York.
I
in?
think I think like for me, Beijing is like a pretty convenient city. Like you get a lot of access to different resources easily because I don't know, there's like so many things going on. but like I wouldn't like consider it necessarily as like a perfect city for me to live in, because like I enjoy more of like a more like less busy and chiller place. Is there a word called chill? I don't know. Like a more chill place where like you get like more connected with like the environment as well as like the neighborhood and people around you. Because I feel like in Beijing there's just too many people and everybody's just like so fast paced, focusing on their own thing that you don't really get a chance to like slow down and like pay attention to like what everybody else is doing and what you're doing. So yeah.
I guess like that's kind of different. Like the perception of whether Beijing like fast paced or slow paced is kind of different for everyone. Because like Beijing, I think there's a lack of integration between like the more cultural areas and the urban areas. So like for
Mm.
example, like the hutongs of Beijing, it's like a very cultural place, and it hasn't really developed since, I don't know, many years ago. But like you see like these new districts in it, Beijing, like the CBD, like around Guomao, and like maybe that's some people's perception of Beijing. So like the financial districts, and maybe the Hutong is people's perception of Beijing. So I guess people view it differently depending on like where and how your lifestyle is. So for me, Beijing is a fast-paced city because I moved here like 8 years ago, and I've never like I don't really go often to the like the Nanluo Guxiang and the places like that are very like cultural and like old Beijing type of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's also interesting that you say that as well because, frankly, as a white man living in Beijing, a lot of expats have very a different view of Beijing. They actually sometimes tend to romanticize the Hutongs a bit as well.
Mm.
And, there's a certain degree where I feel like, they might be, leaning in too much of the romantic aspect of it. But I mean, I do think you made a great point, George, in that most people in Beijing who live in Beijing don't experience the Hutongs really at all on a weekly basis. Maybe like you might visit it once every few months or something like that. But it really isn't something you want to look forward to go into. And I do think that's the part of Beijing where I find very interesting as well because it appeals itself as a very historical cultural center. However, most of the time you go to the CBDs, your Shuangjing, your Guomao, your Sanlitun, as us Chaoyang residents like to go to basically. Um, so I mean, yeah, that's a very interesting aspect in Beijing as well, which I think they have actually were able to foster quite well, I would say. For example, I would say some other cities in China I feel like have kind of are a bit lost in that aspect. For example, my mother's from Changsha, so I go to Changsha quite often. I feel like that city's still trying to find its character. It wants to lean into being this like food capital of China. However, at the same time, it's a very weird city because it feels it's like it's the demographics it's pushing for young people is just too focused, and it's hard for them to really like showcase a different identity. So I think it's quite so I think for a city like Changsha it's quite hard to find its identity like that. But for like a city like Beijing, it's really able to balance this cultural aspect and this aspect of modernity pretty well. So yeah, I mean, at least in my experience of living in Beijing, I think that's something interesting that urbanization has done to Beijing. So yeah.
Okay, so you also want to talk about like the history of Beijing, Arthur, and so I think yeah, we can start talking about that a little.
Okay, I know we're a bit short on time, so I'll just do like the Spark Notes version of it. As you all know, Beijing was the capital of the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. I hope you guys know that. Please tell me you know that. Very important history. And honestly, if you look at Beijing from a satellite view, you're gonna see that it looks kind of like a grid, like if that makes sense, like a little bit like a rectangular grid. And that's because the city is basically built from the built in the image of the imperial city, the Forbidden City. So Beijing used to be built like so let me just try to make sense of this. So you have the Forbidden City in the center, Then you have the surrounding imperial city, and after that you have the original inner city. So that's the original walled part of Beijing. So for example, there are places in Beijing called 东直门、西直门、朝阳门, um, Tianmen, or well, in this case, Zhengyangmen. Those places used to be like the old gates of the inner city, and although the wall has gone, the names of the gates are still there. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Then after a while, after a few decades later, I believe another Ming emperor built decided they wanted to expand the city perimeter of Beijing. So they started building the wall for the outer city. The problem for them was that they ran out of money, so that the city walls for the outer city were actually quite weak and small. But it encompassed quite a large area, and you can consider it as the old suburbs of Beijing. And in the old suburbs of Beijing, you have included very important places like Tiantan, Nongtan, things like that. So like it was still very important to the city, and it was very integral to the city. Now, fast forward a few hundred years to when the People's Republic was founded. The government initiated a policy of mass urbanization. They let a lot of migrant workers come into Beijing to really boost the economy. And they started building around the city and outside the city walls. I mean, they've already been doing that during the Republican era, but they really started to explode during that time. And it was during that point where ideas where many people were discussing of tearing down the city walls. Very famously, famous Chinese architect Liang Sichen opposed the idea. However, at the end of the day, they demolished the walls. And what they did instead were two things. Were two major infrastructure projects. First of all, they demolished the walls so they could build the Line 1 of the Beijing subway, so that it could really integrate the rest of the city as it was developing really quickly. People had to go to work, and they had to commute to work all day. So a subway was needed in the city, and because people needed to commute to work, the idea of destroying the city wall perimeter was that they can build the second ring road of Beijing. So that's basically why ring roads exist in Beijing, and honestly, in a weird way, even though the ring roads, well, at least the second ring road of Beijing was to replace what we now consider as an ancient aspect of old Beijing, in a weird way, it became the new character of Beijing. Because I've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people who don't live in Beijing anymore, and the one thing they remember distinctly about Beijing, that's not the cultural things, but the ring roads of Beijing. And I find that just so fascinating how highways are now considered to be one of the characteristics of a city, like of a very traditional and cultural city like Beijing. So yeah, in a nutshell, after that happened, rapid urban development kept, more people kept coming in. They had to facilitate more. Apologies. They had to facilitate more people, so they kept building. And I know I'm skipping on over a lot of history and a lot of very technical things, but to be honest, that's how Beijing came to be. Came to be as a result of trying to get away from the old, trying to build a new city in a way, but at the end of the day, still returning back to its roots as a deeply cultural and a deeply historic city. And honestly, that's what I find so charming about Beijing, this duality of modernity versus a tradition. And in a weird way, it also and it's that dynamic where you can find many locations in Beijing that are just so contradictory to each other. So yeah, that's all I have to say about the history of Beijing.
Okay, so I guess as for this specific part of this podcast, like since we're running very short on time, I think that would be kind of it for this part. However, hopefully in the future we can have like a part 2, and we can continue this very interesting talk later on. And Arthur, do you have anything that you want to say when we wrap up?
Yes. So to all your beautiful listeners out there, I have one question for you. What makes a utopia for you? What is the city that you want to live in? And yeah, that's about it. What city do you want to live in? And is the city that you are you satisfied with the city you currently live in? Please let us know in the comments. I'm not sure that's what you guys do. But yeah, I think that's it. But you know what? Yeah, ask yourselves that question, guys. But yeah, that's all from me.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I guess that's
Shall we just like wave and say
Oh.
bye?
Yeah, I guess that's the end of the episode. Thank you guys. Bye.
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 Okay.
And Baizawa,
Yeah.
a few decades ago, I mean, Baizawa literally used to be like the field, like a farmland. Baizawa have been, constructed and built up like relative. As you all know, Beijing was the capital of the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. I hope you guys know that. Please tell me you know that. Very important history.